Hey, it's Rick here on 15 October, Saturday night. So I want to talk a little, it's Halloween season, so I want to talk a little about horror movies in general and something a little different tonight. Generally speaking, like 80s horror, okay, was very different. There's a lot of horror movies that came out in the 80s, a lot of them. Popular ones, the series, Freddy, Jason, things like that. And less popular ones, a lot of gory movies. The amount of gore really amped up in the 80s. And of course, I was an 80s kid. I mean, my teenage years were primarily, most of it in the 80s. I was 15 and I turned 15 in 1980. And, so 18 and 83 when I graduated from high school. So my peak years of growing up were in the 80s. I love 80s music, of course. And I thought the 80s had a great aura. It was the last aura of a lot of fun in this country, I think. We've suffered a lot since, but I'm not going to go into that. But the thing about, I really didn't think, I liked a lot of horror movies because I'm a horror movie buff. In the 80s, some of my most favorite entertaining movies come from the 80s, but I don't think 80s horror was actually good horror. Meaning, I don't think it was scary, with exceptions. I think it was entertaining. Oh, yeah. Scary? Here's why. I really don't think 80s horror was really horrible. I'm going to say, well, what do you mean? You like it, but well, okay, I'll give you an example. If you look at serious horror movies, okay, are meant to scare you. A lot of movies nowadays are not that good, unfortunately. They're just whipping them out, and a lot of them are the same, but there are some that are very good, like Sinister. That makes a good horror movie. Why was Sinister such a good horror movie? I think it's one of the best in the last 20 years. Well, it was no joking in it, okay? Once you joke in a horror movie, or you have a one-liner, which the 80s were filled with, you've destroyed any scariness. You've destroyed it at that point. Because if the whole point of a horror movie is to try to put yourself in that scenario if it was in real life, and you would be petrified. That's the whole point of it. If you start joking and casual one-liners like Freddy Krueger used to do, it's not horror anymore. It's a dark comedy. I mean, it's entertaining, but it's not horror. Like, take Sinister, like I said. There was, from start to finish, there was creepiness. There wasn't any joking. There was just about the right amount of gore, which mostly was at the end. And it was a demonic presence that you never really fully saw. It was more in the tapes till the very end when it takes the child away. Very in flashbacks to creepy music. Music is very important. Sound effects in horror. Which is why I thought the 80s failed, generally speaking, for being horror. Because entertaining, all that stuff, but music tended to be too mainstream with the times. Music in the 80s was actually very uplifting and fun. And unfortunately, that transposed to a lot of the horror movies. And they put those in the horror movies. A lot of the 80s music, it just isn't horrible. It may have that environment of the 80s, but it's not really horrible. I mean, some of the great, iconic movies of the 80s. Well, great, eventually, I mean, look, Friday the 13th, most of those were in the 80s, right? Started in 1980, the first one. Nightmare on Elm Street, 84. 84 actually had, the first two came out, I think 84 and 85. Then 87 had Dream Warriors, 89 had Dream Master. Then of course you had Fright Night, Night of the Demons, 1988. Those are some of the real popular ones, but there was a lot of other ones. Sleepaway Camp. A great movie I thought was great, Mausoleum in 1983. Wasn't super popular. I liked it. And then of course there was One Dark Night, came out in 83. And a lot of other. Demons came out in 1985. Demons 2 in 86. Fright Night 2 came out in 87. And a whole host of others. Pieces, Chopping Mall, a lot of like really violent gore fest and stuff. But here's one of the reasons why, compared to like a 70s horror, 80s horror had just too much. One of the themes that I never thought was horrible, and especially as an adult, really turns me off, is 80s started to do this thing where a lot of the horror themes were around teenagers having sex. Why? Why was that such a big thing? Like, as if that's the only thing that horror's around. Teenagers, maybe as a teenager, I didn't mind as much because I was a teenager back then. But as an adult, I grow older. I'm like, I don't want to see that stuff. Sleepaway Camp, Friday the 13th. The whole theme was that. Even some of Nightmare on Elm Street, Night of the Demons. Everything's teenagers getting together in some place and they have sex, and then something comes in and kills them. It got old really quick. I didn't think that theme was mature. It had good script writing. Now, let's go to some of the 70s horror, which was very serious. Like, let's take a made-for-TV movie, 1975, Burnt Offerings, with Karen Black. Very, very suspenseful. Excellent, excellent movie. No teenagers having sex. There wasn't even any real blood. It was just, the 70s wasn't as violent, but it was some really serious good horror. The Legend of Hell House came out in the early 70s with Roddy McDowall. Basically a ghost story in a haunted house. A bunch of mediums go and check out this house with a reputation. Excellent, excellent story. Another, Let's Scare Jessica to Death. If you ever seen that, about a female vampire type creature, like 72, 73. Again, very serious. No joking, no one-liners. None of that stuff. All the way up to Phantasm, which came out in 79, which there's a bunch of them that came out. I like them all, but the first one was a classic. Creepy music. It wasn't any sexual themes for the most part. It was just the tall man, creepy music. There was a serious vein, and I can go on and on, all different types of movies in the 70s. And then The Exorcist, of course, it came out in 74. That was classic. But the 80s, everything started to be like Freddy Krueger. The first Freddy Krueger, he was a scary entity. The music was creepy. It was. Did you see the very first Nightmare on Elm Street? Because you didn't know what he was. And there was quite a bit of violence in it, especially in the beginning when he slices the girl on the ceiling. It was. When you heard that first one in the movie theater, it was. Now they make a second one. I was like, oh, this is going to be really. The second one, which was a little different than all the rest, where he possesses a body. He was somewhat scary. We started with the one-liners. You got the body, I got the brain. And then by the third one, Dream Wars, which was very popular and had darkened music in it and 80s music, it wasn't scary anymore. Oh, it was fun. He's one. Where's the bourbon, bitch? And What a Rush, when he sticks the needles in the girl. All these, these little quips that he did. And it got worse and worse as he went on. It just wasn't scary. Poltergeist, that's not scary. It was typical. Poltergeist reminded me of a ghost version of Ghostbusters, a little or more than that. This wasn't Night of the Demons, okay? It was a great movie, but it wasn't scary. Neither was Fright Night. Fright Night was a good movie, a very good vampire movie, but was it really scary? No. You had the sexy vampire, and you had that 80s type music, and Brewster, who's always joking. It was a good movie, don't get me wrong, but was it really scary? No. Compared to, I thought Burnt Offerings 10 years earlier in 75 was a much more scary movie, made for TV. Salem's Lot, which came out in 79, the end of it. Nothing funny about that. Great Stephen King adaptation. Creepy with that music and the scratching in the windows and creepy sound effects. And everything changed with Friday the 13th, and all of a sudden, silly teenagers acting stupid, sexual stuff, Sleepaway Camp, there was sexual themes, One Dark Night, same thing. Everything started to be teenagers and wisecrack, joking and stuff, and it was like, this doesn't make for a scary movie. If you're trying to make a dark comedy, that's one thing. Like for instance, The Evil Dead, which I thought the first one came out in 81. Actually was a good horror movie, the first one. Then the second one started a little comedy in it. And the third one in 92 was meant to be that. Army of Darkness, I love that movie. But it's meant to be a dark comedy. It's not scary. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be a dark comedy. It's advertised as that, and therefore was effective. A lot of the 80s movies, the iconic Freddy and stuff, they're more dark comedy than they actually are horror. Scary. Demons was, we could say, was sort of scary. 85 and 80. I love those. Straight up gore fest, straight up in your face. But even that with the music, they didn't have creepy music. They had iconic 80s style music, which you know, if you want to make a horror movie scary, sound effects and the music is very vital, which really played well in the 70s and some, but in the 80s, unfortunately, the music was so like 80s music, which isn't scary. It's kind of like fun music. And it kind of killed it, in my opinion, as far as giving a scary thing. Even Day of the Dead, which I love the movie Day of the Dead. One of my favorite movies. My favorite zombie movie ever. 1985, George Romero, the third of the trilogy, Night, Dawn, and Day. I love Day of the Dead. Very violent, very entertaining, but it's not scary. I mean, Captain Rhodes, if you've seen that movie, he's got foul mouth, he's all kind of iconic lines that are actually, and then the doctor they call Frankenstein coming back with funny line. It's not scary. You know, it's not, so, not saying it's not entertaining. It's just not scary. Scary is serious. Scary is not centered around a bunch of kids having sex and some creature comes and kills them. Friday the 13th gets so mundane after the second, third, fourth, first, second, third. Every time someone was near a window, they'd be having sex, and Freddy and Jason comes in. Stabs him, kills him. It was so predictable. It wasn't scary. It was just, I guess back then you get used to it, and you actually wanted Freddy to win. You wanted Jason to win. It was like they were anti-heroes in some sort of way or whatever. But that's my talk. I mean, I love the 80s generation. I'm not saying I didn't like the movies. I'm not saying that. I just didn't think they were scary. If you look at it compared to a lot of great iconic horror that came out before that, and even some after that. Sinister, I mentioned Sinister, Insidious, the first Insidious especially, which I thought was really good. You know, Annabelle Creations. I think it's when the Annabelle one, they're at the boarding house there. That I saw it a couple years ago. Very, very good. Again, serious. No jokes. Once you put one-liners in it, comedy, laughing, joking, you know, unserious music. Once you do that, in my opinion, you lose the effect. Like Night of the Demons, loved that movie in 1988, and the second one in 92. Loved them both. Very entertaining, but again, Angel, even wisecracking. Where you going? Party's just begun. What's Angel's food? Devil's food. That's what it is. He's killing the people. I mean, one-liners that just, all the frightening just goes away when they do that. It becomes kind of funny, you know. But that's just my opinion on 80s horror. I loved it. A lot of them, Creepshow, another great show. Just, they were not scary to me. They did not, it was more campy, typical 80s genre, sort of like the music in the 80s. Fun, you know, sometimes you can take it very serious. And that's what I thought the horror movies are like. There's a lot of them. You get the gore, you get the adventure, you get the iconic statements, comments and stuff, but actual scary, I wouldn't say that 80s horror was actually very scary in my opinion. Just my opinion. Feel free to differ if you want. God bless. Have a great day.